Hello, everybody. I'm Claudia Hammond, and I'm delighted to be here to host Ask the Experts live for the University of Sussex. I was an undergraduate at Sussex studying psychology a little while ago now, and I am back there some of the time now as visiting professor of the public understanding of psychology. The rest of the time, I write and I present All in the Mind, which is a BBC Radio 4 show and podcast on psychology and mental health. And I also cover global health as the presenter of Health Check and The Evidence, which are both on the BBC World Service and obviously both cover a lot about COVID at the moment. Now, this is the third in the university's ever popular Ask the Experts series. I hosted the one back in March, which was on COVID, and then there was one on quantum physics that was hosted by Jim Al-Khalili, another colleague of mine at Radio 4. And they were both fascinating events, and you can still watch them on the university's alumni YouTube channel. But not yet. Don't watch it right now, because first we need to get to grips with consciousness. So what's going to happen now is that I'm going to introduce each of our four really fascinating panelists in turn for them to tell us a bit about their work, and what they have found so far and what it is that they're looking at. And then we're going to turn to your questions. Now, some very organized people have already sent their questions in advance, but it's not too late. So do add any questions you may have to the Q&A bar on your screen, and we will get through as many as we can later on. So let's get started. First of all, we have Anil Seth, who is Professor of Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience at the University of Sussex. And Anil's mission, in a way, is to advance the science of consciousness and to use its insights to see how it can benefit medicine, technology, and society. He has written this amazing book, I'll just wave at you here, called Being You, A New Science of Consciousness. It came out in September. It has been very, very successful. It's already been a Sunday Times top 10 bestseller. It's one of the Guardian Science Book of the Year. It's Financial Times Science Book of the Year, and it's the New Statesman, as of today, Book of the Year. I'm reading it now. It's really brilliant. I can see why it's been such a success. So welcome, Anil, and congratulations on your book. I would love you to give us a brief introduction, really, to your work on consciousness, and perhaps to start to answer one of the most popular questions that's already been sent in. So just an easy one to start you off with. What exactly is consciousness?
That's a very good place to start. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Claudia. So what is consciousness? I think this is the question that we have to struggle with at the very beginning when trying to pursue a science of consciousness. And for me, there's a very simple definition. It's not the end of the road, it's a starting point. And it's mainly a definition I think we can use so that we're all on the same page. And for me, consciousness is any kind of subjective experience whatsoever. It's not the same thing as intelligence. It's not the same thing as language. It's not the same thing as perception or attention. It is any kind of subjective experience. It's what goes away when you're under general anesthesia or in a dreamless sleep. And it's what comes back when you wake up in the morning or come round from anesthesia. The philosopher Thomas Nagel, for me, put it best in quite a long time ago now, when he said, for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism. It feels like something to be me. It feels like something to be each one of you. It probably feels like something to be an elephant or a kangaroo. But there's probably nothing it feels like to be a table or a chair or a laptop computer. That's essentially what consciousness is for me, any kind of subjective experience. Now, in my work, I try and sort of obviously drill down beneath that a bit. And instead of trying to answer this big, almost metaphysical question of how consciousness happens to be part of the universe in the first place and how it relates or is identical to physical stuff. This problem has been described by David Chalmers, a philosopher, as the hard problem of consciousness. Like, why and how should conscious experience be associated with physical stuff in the universe at all? That is a very hard problem. And I think it's a mistake to try and address it head on. In the same way, like in the history of life, people move from trying to find a non-existent spark of life to understanding the different properties that living systems have. And that's what I want to do with consciousness. And I call it the real problem of consciousness, and divide consciousness, instead of one big scary mystery, into at least three related different problems. There's the problem of conscious level. How conscious are you at a particular time? What does explain the difference between being completely unconscious and being awake and aware as we all are now? And in my work in this area with colleagues at Sussex, we've developed measures of neural complexity, of a balance between integration and differentiation in the dynamics of the brain that track how conscious you or somebody else or something else is. Then, aside from conscious level, we have conscious content and conscious self. And here's, for me, I think where the majority of my work and interests are, and again, shared with the other panelists with us today, but and many other colleagues at Sussex too. So when we are conscious, we're conscious of something. There's a perceptual scene with visual experiences, auditory experiences, olfactory experiences, though actually not for me right now because I'm still coming out of COVID. We have a perceptual experience that has content, it has character. And so how do we understand the nature of what we experience at a particular time? And here my approach, building on a lot of previous work, is to think of perceptual experience as a brain-based prediction about the causes of sensory signals. Put very simply, perception isn't about reading the world out. It's not as if the world just pours itself into the mind through the transparent windows of the senses. Our perceptual experience is always generated, constructed by the brain making predictions about what's out there and then using sensory data to update these predictions. So a lot of the day-to-day research in this area is trying to understand that process in more detail. How do brain-based predictions arise? How do they shape what we consciously perceive? And what levels of description in the brain this applies to, low levels, very high levels, and so on. And then finally, and then I'll finish, is an important part of what we're conscious of is being me or being you, the title of the book. The self, in my view, is not something, some essence of identity that sits behind the windows of the eyes doing the perceiving. The self itself is a perception. It's a kind of brain-based prediction or a collection of brain-based predictions. And so a lot of my core interests are understanding how this experience of selfhood arises. Turns out, for me anyway, that it's very closely tied to the living body. So our perceptions that underlie the experience of being me arise because of the brain's fundamental role in controlling the living body. We perceive the world around us and ourselves within it with, through, and because of our living bodies. That's what I do in a nutshell.
What you do. Thank you, Anil. That is a very, very nice description to start us off there. And you said that any kind of subjective experience can be consciousness. And of course, one key aspect of the human experience is our memory for what happens in our lives, and our memory for specific events is what our next guest studies. So please welcome Dr. Alexa Morcom, who is Senior Lecturer in Cognitive Neuroscience. Hello, how are you?
Hello, Claudia, and hi, everyone. Hi, it's such a pleasure to be here. So I'm a senior lecturer in cognitive neuroscience. I'll tell you what that means in a minute. My interest is in human memory, and it's this particular kind of memory that Claudia just referred to, which is our ability to recollect the past. So remembering past events we've experienced. And this is a form of consciousness. It's something that we experience now, but which is something that happened in the past. So we're seeing the past through the lens of the present and vice versa in a way. So how we experience the past depends on the state we're in now, and how we experience the present also depends on what we bring to it. So in my lab, we use lots of methods, particularly human brain imaging methods, to understand recollection. And we focus particularly, so in Anil's kind of division into three, we focus particularly on the content, so on the contents of what people recollect. And we use these methods of human brain imaging, which are ways to measure the brain's activity as you're doing the thinking. So as we're forming new memories for events in the lab, and as we're trying to retrieve these memories, put this information back together again and have that experience sometimes of actually reliving the past. We measure people's brain activity with the MRI scanner. So we use functional magnetic resonance imaging to look at how the brain can light up in different areas and different patterns according to what people are experiencing in the memory task. And we also use a very rapid kind of brain signal called EEG, electroencephalography, and this allows us to get moment by moment snapshots of what's happening as people have memory experiences. So memory is also interesting in consciousness science because it's quite difficult to tell the two apart, and this is possibly something that will come up in the discussion, but I know that people that kind of primarily study consciousness are always trying to study consciousness without getting it confused with memory, because although memory feels like we're reliving the past, it's really a reconstruction. So that seeing through the lens, and so telling them apart and trying to understand their relation to each other is really interesting and really important thing to do. I think that's just about it from me.
And that's interesting. You said that consciousness and memory are so closely related, because I think lots of people would think, just looking at those topics, would think, oh well, what's memory got to do with consciousness? Isn't that something different because memory is the past? But are you saying it is entwined?
I think so. I mean, the memory experiences we have are a form of conscious experience, and they can feel very vivid, and we can sometimes take it a little bit literally to think that when we're remembering, we're just putting back together the parts. But if you look at, so one of the things we do is we measure brain activity when people are experiencing events that we give them to experience, and then we measure it again when they're remembering the events, and the patterns are kind of similar, but they're not the same at all. And in the same way as the experiences are different, and these methods give us a potential window onto understanding better what the content of memory experiences is and what drives it, and how it can be so wildly inaccurate as well as such a vivid representation of the past.
And is this because of the memories we have of our lives and what's happened to us? It's not like having a load of, DVDs on the shelf or files on your computer and you get the right one and just play it perfectly back again. It's just not what happens.
It's definitely not what happens. So Elizabeth Loftus, who's a famous memory researcher in the States, who's done a lot of work on false memory, she famously describes memory as not being a recording, but being a Wikipedia page, because it undergoes all this editing and sort of changes and transformations. And every time we retrieve a memory, we kind of reform it and we transform it. And so the experiences we're having of the past, they're true in a way, but they're not a literal representation of the past like a video recording might be.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there's much more to ask you later on as well. Thank you for that. Now, of course, we don't all experience the world in the same way. And next we have Professor Jamie Ward, who looks at the variety of experiences that different individuals might have of the world. And he is co-director of the Lieberhume Doctoral Scholarship Programme, and also the president of the British Association of Cognitive Neuroscience and founding editor of Cognitive Neuroscience, and he is at Sussex as well. So Jamie, can you tell us a little bit about your work and about how people do experience the world around them?
Yes, indeed. So for centuries, if not millennia, people have been puzzled about whether, for example, my experience of red is the same as your experience of red. Is my own private subjective experience different from yours? How could we possibly know? Well, I think to some extent we're starting to give answers to that, but actually each one of us can have a fundamentally different private reality created by individual differences in the way that our brains are wired. So I'm well known for studying something called synesthesia. So in synesthesia, for example, the sound of something might not just be an auditory experience, it might be a flash of red. So here, this is a very good example of where for some people a sound is just a sound, and for other people a sound is a color plus a sound, or maybe as they're listening to my words now, they have taste. So in this particular example, we know that people are having their own subjective conscious experiences that differ from one person to the next. Why is that? Well, again, we don't fully know the answer, but we do know that these people differ in terms of their genetics, and they differ in terms of the way that their brain is wired. And it can come in a whole variety of different experiences. So again, how do you recruit people with synesthesia? Well, they regard it as perfectly normal to have synesthesia, I should say, because that is the only way that they experience the world. So one of our undergraduates emailed me and said, well, I don't know whether this is synesthesia, but whenever I see somebody being touched on their face, I feel it on my face. and they assumed everybody would have that same experience, that they feel touch when they see this. And of course, most people do not experience that. We also know that other kinds of disturbance of the brain, for want of a better word, such as amputation, where your brain might reorganize as a result of losing the limb, but you still have a subjective experience that your hand is there and that you can still move it. And maybe you've got pain in a hand that does not physically exist. Or maybe after, if you damage your eyes or your retina, you won't be able to see. Well, you won't be able to see through your eyes, but actually maybe when you listen to music, you will start to see flashes of light, or maybe you can re-experience a vision in other ways. So what does this tell us? What have we learned? Well, when a lot of people have looked at synesthesia and thought, well, actually, what this shows is that you can superimpose unusual conscious experiences on a normal, in inverted comma, brains, that you have altered consciousness in a brain that is otherwise functioning just the same as everybody else's. And that's a very intriguing idea, but unfortunately, I don't think it's right. People with synesthesia and people who have unusual experiences have unusual brains. To some extent, the unusual experiences are a product of having unusual brains. It's not that you've kind of superimposed consciousness or subjective experiences onto a typically functioning brain. And what are the ingredients then of this? Well, it might be differences in the way that you can create your own imagery, your own internal imagery, the way that you kind of interpret those imagery. It might be to do with the way that you kind of learn, individual differences in learning mechanisms, for example, that maybe you hold on to perceptual memories and, for want of a better word, kind of confuse them. You confuse a memory for touch for a perception of touch. I think it also forces us to redefine what we mean by being normal. All of a sudden, if some people are experiencing colours for sounds, other people are experiencing other people's touch, other people have this, other people have that, we're kind of chipping away at this kind of concept of normal, and there is nobody left at the end of it. So where does that leave us? Obviously, how do we account for these differences? We can throw our hands up in the air and say, well, everybody's unique, but that's not really a fully satisfactory explanation as well. And how do we define that kind of grey area between what most people have and, for example, pathology, diagnosis? So again, neurodiversity, people with autism are kind of trying to reclaim that and say, no, we're not pathological, we have differences. Is that the right way forward? So those are interesting questions, and hopefully we might get some questions along those lines.
So can the study of these different experiences start to tell us more about what consciousness is, in a way?
Yes, I guess so. I mean, at the most simple level, it tells us that it is created by your own interpretations of the world rather than the world itself. That would be the most simple thing. But then the mystery is, well, why? Why should our own interpretations of the world feel like anything at all? Because maybe you can program a computer to interpret the world in some sense, but does that mean that it has consciousness? So you can approach the question that way, and you can give answers to it, but whether or not those answers fully satisfy, I think is open to debate.
So would your work fit in then with Anil's view of consciousness as something where we're having these perceptions and then we're getting these signals and we're creating our image of the world, in a sense?
Yeah, so to some extent you could say a synesthete experiences a sound as red has a prediction that sound is going to generate red, and it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. So for other people, it's almost as if they're seeing that what they predict, in effect, that they are kind of superimposing on the world their predictions, whereas other people would kind of be more malleable and they would change their predictions to suit the world, if you will, and you could do it both ways round.
That is fascinating. Now we have one more panelist to hear from before we come to your questions. I see some people are putting those into the Q&A already. Do add those in. And so finally, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Zoltan Dienes, who's worked at Sussex since 1990. And in your research, you look at how we can learn complex information, even when we don't know what we're learning, and how we can control our subjective experiences and even misrepresent, if you like, reality. And I'm fascinated by this idea. So Zoltan, tell us more.
Yes. So one way of understanding consciousness is to look at the difference between conscious and unconscious processes. And that's been one of my interests, is how we can learn often quite complicated information or subtle information, and we can do it consciously or unconsciously, and what are the differences? An everyday example of learning complex information unconsciously is how we learned our native language. So linguists don't have a complete grammar of natural language, but somehow by age 5, and without thinking about it much, the child has a pretty good grasp of all the major grammatical constructions of that language and can use it in a fraction of a second to produce or understand utterances. And in a way, it doesn't, just to go back to what Anil was saying about consciousness, it doesn't feel like anything to know a particular rule of grammar, right? It just feels like you're talking. You might have some sense of fluency, or you're getting your ideas out, but you don't have a sense of, it's like something to know this particular rule of the grammar. You're not aware of the knowledge that you have. And you can replicate that to some extent in the lab by giving people artificial grammars, sequences that are structured in some way, but are sufficiently complicated that people don't consciously learn the rules, but nonetheless can gain intuitions or even guesses. It can feel to them like they're simply guessing. So in the experiments, sometimes they'll say, distinguish these items which are either rule following or not, and they say, well, I can't really do that. I haven't learned anything. But then their guesses turn out to be better than chance. Or they have feelings like intuition, and sometimes intuition is an indication that you do have unconscious knowledge that's relevant to the situation. It's just that you don't know what it is. Another everyday example is perceptual motor skills. So how people run to catch a ball might be in the air for some seconds, and the person knows which direction to run and what speed to be at the right place at the right time. And we know what people are doing when they do that. They're monitoring the angle at which they're looking up at the ball, so that the ball keeps looking a certain way to them. So they're not working out where the ball is or the trajectory of the ball. They're just keeping the ball looking a certain way, and that will guarantee interception of the ball. The rule would end up having the ball hit them between the eyes, but they catch it at the last minute. And so they're following a very particular rule to do with controlling that angle, but they don't know that they're doing that. They get it quite wrong when you ask them what they're doing. So that's one issue I'm interested in, is the distinction between unconscious and conscious processing, maybe in learning or perception. The other one you mentioned is people have to varying extents an ability to control the subjective experiences they have such that they misrepresent reality in ways that are consistent with their goals and despite sustained evidence to the contrary. An example people may well have come across about that is hypnosis. So you can have and almost everyone can experience magnetic hands, where you imagine your hands are magnets, and it feels to you as if your hands are being pulled together by themselves by the magnets, or pushed apart by the magnets. So you can have the illusion of voluntary motions appearing involuntary, or imagination appearing as perception, as hallucinations, or you're pretending something, but you come to believe it as a belief, so you have delusions. So that can happen in hypnotic context, but it happens rather more generally than that. You don't need to be in any hypnotic state, just some people have the ability of what I call phenomenological control. An example that people may have heard about that outside of the hypnotic context is ASMR. It's just entered the English language. It's the notion that some sounds like whispering or some other sounds give you tingles in the head and the neck. When we've measured this, or Peter Lush, who's been working with me for 10 years, measured people's tendency to have these experiences, and we also measure their ability the capacity for phenomenological control. It varies pretty perfectly with the capacity for phenomenological control. So if you're zero on phenomenological control, you don't have these experiences at all. And as you have more phenomenological control in general, you have more of these tingling experiences. So that particular phenomenon is probably a product of people's ability to create experiences to fit their desires and goals for whatever reason. Another situation in which you might want to change your experiences in ways it doesn't seem to you that you're producing the experiences, they're just happening by yourselves. Maybe if someone else is in pain and you'd like to be empathic, you feel the pain. That's called a vicarious pain. You see someone else in pain and you feel the pain. That's work. Jamie Ward has done some work on that. When you correlate that against phenomenological control, you get a nice relationship as well. So that's an experience that people can create in themselves in order to maybe satisfy their desire to be empathic. But in that particular case, when phenomenological control goes to zero, vicarious pain, so the people who are zero on phenomenological control can still feel vicarious pain. So phenomenological control doesn't completely explain that particular effect, only some of it. So that's those are roughly my interest in consciousness science, but I'm also interested in science as a general process and how you reform it. Science is self-correcting, both in terms of particular beliefs and also by the methods which it uses. And so, for example, if you want to show some process is unconscious, you might want to show there's no conscious processing going on. So you have to show that something does not exist. And the methods scientists have been using to show that something does not exist haven't really been up to the task. What they've done is to show I didn't find evidence for something being there. But that leaves open two options, that you just didn't have good enough evidence, or you had evidence for something not being there. So how do you distinguish those two states of affairs is something I've been very interested in the last 10 years and promoting particular methods for doing that in general. And also promoting the last 10 years reform in science in terms of overcoming certain biases by having papers published before the data are collected, accepted before the data are collected, so that the results that you get in no way bias the acceptance of papers into the scientific literature.
Yes, and so that's something that then sorts out the problem of the papers being much more likely to be published if they have significant results. So if they found a difference between some groups or found some sort of effect, rather than if they didn't. So you could have one study published that found something that seems extraordinary, but 99 other people found you didn't. But that doesn't get published, and so it starts to get around that effect. One thing I wanted to ask you was you mentioned whether people had high or low phenomenological control. How do you measure that?
You give people a series of imaginative exercises. Magnetic hands would be an example of that. You say, imagine your hands are like magnets, and as you imagine your hands being like magnets, you'll feel a force pulling your hands together, and you'll notice your hands coming closer and closer. And then you ask people, did you feel a force so that your hands moved by themselves? It seemed to you that they were moving by themselves. And so what we do is in about a 45-minute session is we give a series of 10 suggestions like that, 10 imaginative exercises, including not just movements, but also perceptual experiences like changes in taste or hearing and seeing things, or losing memory for what's happened. Yeah. So, yeah, it's a 45-minute stream.
So is that like measuring suggestibility? And whether people are suggestible to hypnosis or not?
Yes, it's essentially the same thing, except the word hypnotic suggestibility I don't really like, because hypnosis means sleep in Greek, and it's got nothing to do with sleep. And suggestibility, if you say to someone, we found you're suggestible, that's a bit of an insult, really. But it's more, but I prefer to think of it as more of a capacity for phenomenological control. It's a capacity that some people have that often they don't know that they have. And also the hypnosis stuff comes with a whole lot of baggage and mythology. You don't need to be in a special state. In fact, I don't believe there is a special state. There are people high in phenomenological control can create altered states in themselves just because they can change their subjective experiences in whatever way they feel fit. So the altered state is just another exercise of phenomenological control and is in no way needed to respond to these exercises successfully.
Yeah. All fascinating areas of work. Well, thank you to all four of you for outlining your work you do there. And now we're going to turn to all the questions, because this is Ask the Experts after all. So we're going to turn to your questions. There's all sorts of questions coming in, and there are other ones, as I said, that people sent earlier as well. So let's start with a few on consciousness more specifically. Now, it's interesting that what we have been talking about here is things like perception and memory. Mike says, and Anil, I wondered what you thought about this. Is it possible to define consciousness without talking about things like perception or attention? And that discussions often on consciousness often seem to end up talking about other things like perception or memories that we've done, and not consciousness itself.
I think it's both possible and necessary, but it doesn't mean that these things are independent, and they're in fact very much not independent, but they do pick out different things. I mean, back to David Chalmers' description at the beginning of this hard problem, he talks about capacities like perception, the ability to form some representation of the environment, attention, selective processing of whatnot. These are all functions in the vicinity of consciousness, but they don't really focus on the fact that conscious experiences exist in the first place, nor what their experiential character is, like why an experience of emotion has the feeling that it does compared to, let's say, a visual experience. Of course, studying perception can help us address this question, but you can study perception without talking about consciousness. A lot of people have done that for the last century. You can study attention without talking about consciousness. A lot of people have done that for 100 years as well. Same thing with memory. I think consciousness picks out a sort of overlap of all these areas, but there is something very distinctive about it too. It's the thing that unites people who might be interested in anesthesia with people who might be interested in autobiographical memory or synesthesia or the state of phenomenological control. There's something common to all these areas that picks out the nature of the experience that is being had, and its relation then to all these other processes. So the answer is kind of yes, you have to, and I think there's a danger of sort of forgetting that sometimes and just focusing on the functions that brains implement in conjunction with bodies and the behaviors that an organism expresses. I think to study consciousness, you've got to keep a focus on the subjective side of it, the experiential character of what's going on.
Well, here's a question about experiences, and Alexa, I thought it might be interesting to put this to you in terms of memory, maybe. A question: what is the function of consciousness, and what are our experiences for?
Well, I don't think anyone knows but almost any sort of mental function, but it is important to ask the question. So there has actually been some interesting work in memory, and this isn't directly about consciousness, but in the last sort of 10 years or so, we think of memory in terms of our past experiences, and we think, well, what's the function of remembering events? And we can come up with things like certain animals, in fact, quite surprisingly, some birds, for example, can remember where they put things and when, and that's one of the characteristics of memory. So you can kind of take it down to the nitty-gritty and say, well, that's why we've got the memory. But then other people have been exploring, it seems, a very close link between our memory for the past and our ability to imagine the future. And it looks like these rely on very much the same brain regions and networks, and in many respects are the same sort of conscious state, because it's about sort of simulating something that happened before, not literally, or simulating the future, imagining what's going to happen, again, sort of through the lens of where you are now. So yeah, so I guess that's my kind of answer, but it's not really an answer, but it can be surprising. And when you do ask that question, then you can find out more about the thing you're trying to understand.
Yeah. And Zoltan, here's one. You mentioned awareness. Is there a difference between consciousness and awareness? In some languages, the audience member says there may be only one word for this. In other languages, there'll be several words. So is there a difference?
Good.
You were muted then. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. I think where there's a difference between consciousness and awareness is a sort of a terminological issue. consciousness feels like it would naturally apply in terms of what Anil was talking about with levels of consciousness. So, you know, are you conscious or unconscious? Are you asleep or awake? Are you knocked out? Are you in a coma? People tend to use consciousness in that context. Awareness often comes up in the context of contents of consciousness. So if some of the contents of your consciousness seem to be presenting themselves to you as being something it's like to have them, you're aware of having them. So conscious knowledge is knowledge you know that you know. You're aware of having that knowledge. So yeah, the terms slightly different in that way. One might apply more naturally to contents than the others.
And you mentioned sleep then, and somebody asked, are you conscious when you're asleep but dreaming? Yeah,
so that makes a nice distinction between different senses of consciousness, because you can say someone's unconscious when they're asleep or knocked out. But a person who is knocked out or dreaming can be very conscious in another sense, particularly when they're dreaming. They can be having very rich perceptual experiences and other sorts of experiences when you're dreaming. So yeah, you certainly do have conscious experiences while you're dreaming, even though you could say of the person they are unconscious. So it is good to distinguish these different senses of the term so we know what we're talking about.
And Jamie, this is one for you, I think, from Louisa, who says, because you mentioned about, you know, seeing red, are we all seeing the same thing? And she says, I don't understand how colour cannot be real and can be a fragment of your consciousness or your imagination. How is it that how are we all experiencing the same thing then?
I think one interesting question is whether you could have red if you've had no visual experience before. And I think that's perhaps a point to which I kind of get the sense in which the question's being asked, because I'm quite skeptical about those sorts of claims. But again, you know, maybe others would want to kind of say that. So to some extent, our conscious experiences are kind of constrained by some reality. They're not completely free-flowing. So we have a memory of experiences that we have labeled or categorized or something as red. And to some extent, what we're trying to do is we're reinstating those categories or those instances based on the kind of incoming signals. So I do think that the eyes and our inputs and our history of seeing and all the rest does matter, but it's not the end point. It's just one part of it, and whether it's the main part or whether it's kind of just, you know, a kind of constraining part, and the reality is coming mainly from the top down. You could have that debate.
So there is a property, say, of a table that's red. So there is a physical property of that table that makes it red and not green. But does that mean we could all be experiencing something different when we see it, even if we all agree to call it red?
So basically, I mean, you could take something that measures wavelength. You could take a bunch of red objects and show that there's something broadly in common. But nevertheless, you could take something that we all agree on is yellow and put it in a different coloured light and have a perception of red, even though this thing is telling you that it's not. So you can, you know, so I'm not a denier of redness itself, but you can have things that are going to be physically not categorized as red, but everybody subjectively agrees that they are.
Yeah, thank you for that.
So it seems like seeing a banana in different colored light, you know, this sort of thing.
Yeah. Anil, here's one for you about consciousness and logical thinking. Are these only found in humans, or are they also present in animals?
Before I turn to that, I just wanted to jump on the answer to Jamie's answer a second. I think color is a super interesting example, because I mean we can go right back in philosophy to John Locke, who made this distinction between primary and secondary qualities. So there's a primary quality, something has solidity, something that basically exists independently of an observer. And color is an example of a secondary quantity, something also like money, something that requires a mind to exist. So color, objects will have surface reflectance properties, as Jamie said. You know, you can measure reflectances of wavelengths, and objects will have these properties. But those properties themselves aren't red. Red is constructed by the brain by interacting with those properties. Cézanne, the painter, said color is where the brain and the universe meet. The really puzzling thing from a consciousness perspective is that, of course, we experience colors normally as being real parts of the world. When I see a red bus, I experience the redness as being an objective, mind-independent property of the bus. But it isn't. It's a construction of the brain based on just a few wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation. And actually, Jamie and I have talked repeatedly about one interesting thing here, which is for synesthetic colors. When people have a synesthetic color experience, for some of them, it may be that they don't experience the color as being a objectively existing part of the outside world. So there are some subtle but really interesting and illuminating differences between the ways in which we can experience color in relation to the world. Now, on this question of logical thinking, is it something that only humans can do or other animals? Well, it kind of depends what you mean by logical thinking. There are many different forms of reasoning that can all be described as logical in some sense. I think probably what the question has in mind is a sort of very rigorous deductive, if A and B then C type of logic. And here, the evidence, I would say, is probably quite mixed. I mean, we humans, we're not very good at it, which is why we have computers to do all this for us. But we can certainly do it. We have the kind of symbolic reasoning capacities that allow us to do it. I think in other animals, and maybe the others will know more about this than me, there's some sort of evidence of what you could describe as logical reasoning, like scrub jays hide food somewhere and then move it if they think they've been observed by another scrub jay. You can think of that as a sort of logical deduction about the consequences of being observed. But it's unclear quite what the under the hood mechanisms are that are allowing these behaviors to be performed. In a wider sense, of course, the answer is clearly yes. I mean, there's, as well as deductive reasoning, there's inductive reasoning. Things happen, so things will keep happening, and abductive reasoning, which is basically this process of inference about the brain making a best guess of what's out there. And I think that kind of reasoning, that kind of abductive logic, is basically what brains are set up to do everywhere and all the time.
Yes, and of course we do see animals learn to do different things. Yes, Zoltan.
There's another sort of set of abilities that might be referred to there. So one way of thinking about consciousness is it involves reflecting on your mental states, thinking about thinking. And people have tried to see to what extent can animals know what mental states they're in. And it turns out that you can get evidence for apes, dolphins, and some other creatures, macaques, that they seem to know when they don't really know something, so that they can choose an uncertainty response, or they can express their uncertainty in some way. So if we take that sort of mental states about mental states, thinking about thinking, then you can find it in some animals and not in others. It seems not to be in capuchins, New World monkeys, but is in Old World monkeys. I went to Taiwan some years ago with my son. He was about 5 at the time, and he feasted on roasted deep fried bees. And then on my next trip to Taiwan, I heard a talk how bees can pass this task, that they can show an uncertainty response. So I decided to take bees off my menu after that.
Wow. And here's a good memory question for you, Alexa. We can have memories that are so vivid that our conscious experience is like being back there. Is there a detectable neural difference when the recollected experience really did happen in the past compared with when it didn't? So when it was a false memory that never happened?
This is a really interesting and good question that's actually one that's been asked by researchers over the last 15 years or so. So when we first started realizing quite how distorted our memories can be in the 1990s or so, one of the things that people started doing was using these new techniques of brain imaging, particularly the functional MRI, the one that allows you to look at different brain regions. So you can look and see if the visual brain regions at the back of the brain are activated, or whether the ones that are just more mainly associated with memory, like the hippocampus in the middle, whether those are activated. And they really expected that even if people couldn't give a clear visual, verbal report, that by looking at the brain, we'd be able to see the reality that these true memories were different from the false memories. And it's actually much more complicated than that, and the jury is very much still out, and that nobody's found an objective way yet to tell whether a memory is true or false in the sense that it really happened in the past.
Yeah, because if you could use that as a kind of neuroimaging lie detector, couldn't you? You could find out whether somebody was telling you about a real experience or not.
Exactly. It's been tried, and it's sort of notoriously unreliable for lots of reasons.
Yeah. Now we've got a couple of questions about machines here. Whether a machine can be conscious, and if not, why not? Is it something that can only be a property of biological symptoms? And also whether there is value in studying consciousness for autonomous machines and robotic systems. So could the principles of consciousness help us build machine intelligence? Who would like to take that one?
I can have
Anil.
a go.
Yeah.
I can start that anyway. So with respect to the first, actually take the second part first. What's the value for studying consciousness in AI, autonomous machines, and so on? I think there is a strong value here. This gets back to one of the first questions actually about the function of consciousness. So we are conscious creatures, and biology has long told us that nothing can really be understood in biology except in light of evolution, except in light of function, what a conscious experience is for. So here we can use computational modeling, we can use artificial intelligence to try and understand, well, what can we do specifically because we are conscious? There are many candidate functions, like Zoltan mentioned, the ability to know what we know, to reflect on our mental states, to have, very broadly speaking, metacognition. This is something that's actually lacking in many AI systems at the moment. They do stuff, but they don't evaluate their own performance in any useful way, in the way that we do. So that's something that we can both build into AI on the basis of our understanding of consciousness, but also use AI models to try and understand how brains are doing this, and therefore what some of the brain mechanisms of consciousness might be in us. And there are many other examples. I think for me, the most significant is that a conscious experience binds together a huge amount of relevant information in a single unified scene, which represents our sort of affordances for behavior, like the actions we can make with respect to the goals that we have. This is an incredibly useful thing for an organism to have. Most AI systems don't have this kind of goal-directed multi-sensory binding going on. And again, the flow is bidirectional here too. It can be useful in both ways. So there's a lot to be gained here. But to the more fundamental question, can a machine be conscious? And by machine, I mean, we're all machines. We're just machines made out of particular stuff. Can a machine made out of silicon be conscious? Well, it depends what theory of consciousness you prefer and what sort of philosophical perspective you might be bringing along for the ride. So a very common assumption is functionalism. And functionalism says that it doesn't matter what a system is made of. All that matters is what it does, how it transforms inputs to outputs. You program a computer in the right way, and the lights will come on. This is a very common trope in a lot of science fiction. And it seems to be a fairly common belief among a lot of neuroscientists and philosophers too. I'm personally agnostic about this. I don't see any strong reason to either believe it's the case or rule it out completely. Some things, when you sort of simulate them in a functional way, actually give rise to the phenomenon. A computer that simulates playing chess actually plays chess. But for other things, that's not the case. If you simulate a weather system in a computer, as happens in many places in weather forecasting centers everywhere, it does not get wet and windy inside the computer. Rain is substrate dependent. It depends on the stuff that it's made of. So which is consciousness? Is it more like chess or is it more like the weather? Now, I tend to think if I had to come down on one side or the other, I think it's more likely to be like the weather. And this is partly because whereas in a computer, you've got a sharp distinction between the software, the program, the functions, and the hardware, what it's made out of. In the brain, there's no such sharp distinction. It's not a sharp distinction between the mindware and the wetware. It's just like all the way down. There are interlinked processes that go on that bottom out in this fundamental imperative of our bodies and our cells within our bodies to persist over time.
And also, I mean, your book's called Being You, and you've said it's about the sense of feeling you're you. So how could the AI machine ever feel in the same way and feel that it was itself in the way that we know what that feels like?
Well, I think it could certainly simulate it. I think the much more realistic worry that we should have, and in fact is already happening, that AI systems can give the strong impression of being conscious. You know, you couple some sort of deep fake technology with a language generation thing, and you already have something that gives the strong appearance of being as conscious as you or me, even though there's actually nothing that it is like, that it feels like to be that deep fake program coupled to a language generation program. And this, for society, I think, is going to be quite problematic, because we'll be living in a world where we're surrounded by agents, whether they're virtual or perhaps real, once robotics gets up to the job, which give the impression of being conscious, but which we either remain agnostic about or have good reason to believe are not. And that's going to distort how we interact with these systems, with each other, and with other animals.
Thank you for that. We've just got time for a couple of quick ones. Alexa, what happens if someone loses their memory? Do they continue to be themselves?
That's another great question. I think it depends on what you mean by being yourself, really. I mean, I'm the classic academic where I sort of turn around the question a bit and say it depends. But yourself isn't just necessarily one thing. And you know, whilst we sort of think, well, if I lost my memory, I kind of wouldn't be the same person, because I wouldn't be able to think about my past experiences and feel like I was being shaped by them. It's also the case, there's a lot more to it. There's the things you know, and all the many things that you can do unconsciously and without remembering it, that as Zoltan was explaining. So I guess I would say broadly yes, but not the same.
Mm-hmm. And a quick one for you, Zoltan, as well. You were talking about ASMR, where people get these, you know, tingly feelings, and there's loads of videos online with people watching people folding towels, or you know, stroking people's heads and so on, and brushing people's hair. Is ASMR a purely socio-cultural phenomenon?
Yeah, so I would suggest that it is. It's just you know, a way of behaving that people have learnt about. It's you know, in the atmosphere, people learn how you're supposed to respond, and they create those experiences in themselves. And these sort of things change over time. So back in the 1700s, being possessed by demons was more the in thing, and people would become possessed by demons, and then you could exorcise them. And you know, that changes. ASMR is a current version.
But would you say they are really feeling the thing, but they've learned?
Oh no, when you engage in phenomenological control, you genuinely feel it. So it's not. So my claim is not as people are sort of play acting or pretending. Not only do they genuinely feel it, they don't know that it is they themselves that are creating it. So they can feel insulted when you say that you know, it's just a sociocultural effect, as if it wasn't a genuine experience. No, it's a genuine experience that feels to happen by itself. And these experiences you can create by phenomenological control can be quite surprising to the person who generates them. So I was in a cafe with a PhD student who was high on phenomenological control, Rebecca, and I said, "Did you know you could turn that green bottle in front of you and turn it red?" And she said, "No." Oh my God, it's turned red. So she didn't know that she had this experience to create, as Anil's talking about, a sense of something out there in the world that exists objectively, but actually it's just their creation because it fits in with their goals and intentions.
Well, that was absolutely fascinating, and we are already almost out of time. Now, I have learnt a lot, and so I hope all you have too. We have a quick poll that's going to come up on the screen, and it is: has your knowledge and understanding of consciousness increased throughout the evening? So if you could answer that would be great. That should have appeared on your screens now, so you can choose the answer that you feel is most relevant. This is just for us to use afterwards, so it won't be coming up here. So while you are just doing that, all that is left for me to do is to thank our extremely busy panel who've all made time today once again for taking part in this evening's session. And I think we have managed to pack an enormous amount into this hour, or they've managed to pack an enormous amount into this hour. We've covered such a range of topics there. So thank you so much to Alex, Zoltan, Anil, and Jamie. Remember, if you want to watch the previous events, they are on the YouTube channel. And thank you all so much for attending, and thank you everybody for your really great questions as well. And do look out for the next Ask the Expert session from Sussex University, which will be in the new year. So thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.